started and see if people trickle in. All right, I'm gonna get started. So my name's Taylor. I am a PhD candidate in clinical psych at Rutgers, and I work at the GVRC. And today I'm going to be talking about this funded project that is in the midst of data collection. It's funded by the GVRC, and super excited to be able to collect this data and to share it with you. So this project essentially focuses on mental health care providers and asking questions about their screening practices. So if they are asking clients about whether or not they have access to firearms, and then as well as their perceptions of firearm safety discussions to reduce a firearm-related injury. So when I talk about mental health care providers in this study, I'm talking about people who are providing mental health services outside of general medical settings. So not psychiatrists or DMPs who may be giving mental health services, but more so like psychologists, clinical social workers, psych associates, things along those lines. So I'm sure you guys have heard this multiple times today, but there are quite a lot of firearms in the US. About 42% of households in the US have a firearm, and just having a firearm in the home can increase the risk of a host of things like suicide, domestic dispute, homicide, accidental shootings. And these risks are particularly high when firearms are stored unsecurely, generally meaning if the firearms are stored loaded, unlocked, kind of with ready access. So there's been a lot of talk today and just in general in this research area to really focus on secure firearm storage to mitigate those risks. So when we talk about secure storage, we're talking about rendering a firearm inoperable during storage. So separate from ammunition, locked, unloaded, right? So there's lots of research to suggest that just securing your firearms in this way can mitigate those risks that we outlined on the last slides. But we know that most firearm owners do not store all of their firearms securely. And because of that, there's been a lot of efforts to figure out ways that we can increase that, ways we can reach out to firearm owners and really promote more secure storage practices. And one way we could do that is by having conversations with firearm owners. We know that even like one-on-one conversations with firearm owners can help to increase secure storage methods and kind of facilitate ways to really help mitigate those risks. And I think that this is particularly important for folks in mental health treatment because they're at a higher risk for suicide. And when people are in mental health treatment, this is a connection they already have. They're especially outside of those medical settings, outside of like psychiatrists, for instance, you're seeing someone fairly regularly, you're trying to build that relationship with them. And so I think that that's an area that we can really lean into. And so outside of these broad conversations and public health level interventions, I think it's also important to really think about bringing these conversations into the context of general mental health treatment. But we kind of have limited understanding of what these conversations might look like in mental health care if they're happening. And one of the things that leads to these conversations is asking if people have access to a firearm, right? So that screening process, which if you popped into some of the other talks along these lines, that we've talked a lot about how screening for firearm access doesn't happen a whole lot. So people aren't asking that question, figuring out who has access to those firearms. And so that never gives the opportunity to have conversations to increase secure storage. Most of what we know about having these conversations and screening for access is outside of mental health care. But like from a client perspective, we've seen that most people have pretty much said they have never been screened for firearm access by any healthcare provider. So they were able to just say in general, like any provider, and most people haven't been asked about firearms. And then from the provider perspective, most report that they don't have regular screening practices, they don't have regular safety discussions, and there's a lot of barriers to having these conversations. And so from a data set of psychiatrists and one study that looked at clinical psychologists, there's a couple of main barriers that continuously pop up. So things like they think that clients don't necessarily need to have these conversations, or they don't have enough time in their practice to be able to talk about these things. They lack the expertise and the training to have the conversations adequately and with enough information, or the clients maybe just aren't interested. So again, we know a little bit, but this information is really not within the context of general mental health treatment, things like therapy. And I think that this is a context that I was really interested in, given my own background in clinical psych. And so that's what this current project really focuses on. So the main questions I'm asking is, how often are these mental health care providers screening for firearm access? And if they are screening, do the practices differ based on the client or based off of the treatment setting itself? And do their practices or even confidence discussing firearms differ based on their own characteristics? And then also identifying what those primary barriers to screening are among this population. So the study is online and remote, takes less than an hour. I'm trying to recruit about 285 mental health care providers, and I do have an incentive for that thanks to the GBRC funding. And I wanted to highlight just kind of the types of questions I'm asking, the way that the survey is built. So I have a set of quality assurance items to make sure people are responding consistently and truthfully. And then I also have some bot checks built into the survey, which is super important when we think about online data collections. And then the providers are also answering questions based off of their general demographics. So things we would ask everyone about race, gender, ethnicity, things like that. And then I have a set of questions that are specific to the provider's work context. So what types of clients do they typically work with? What area of psychology or mental health have they been trained in, whether it be in psychology or social work or things like that? And then what types of settings that they work in currently. And then for questions about firearms, there's kind of a bunch of different kind of categories. The first of being about firearm access screening. So do they ask clients about their access to firearms? If they do, who do they ask most often? And how often do they ask them? How do they ask them, right? Get behind those kind of methods. And then there's some questions about their general firearm beliefs. So these would be things like kind of like true false questions about how much they might know about risks associated with firearms, what we know about firearms and mental health specifically. And then also some questions about how much they believe that mental health and or I guess I should say it backwards. So how much they think that firearm conversations are relevant for mental health settings. And then the last set of questions is about whether or not they own a firearm themselves. And if they do own a firearm, what does that ownership look like? So why do they own? How do they store their own firearms? Things along those lines. And then what are their own experiences with firearms? Did they grow up around them, for instance? So I don't have any data to show you guys today, but I do want to kind of highlight what types of things I'm kind of expecting and how I'm kind of thinking about the data collection. So generally, I'm expecting pretty low rates of screening, and this hasn't necessarily been looked at specifically within this population, right? But what we do know is that most providers aren't screening very often, and most people are saying they haven't been asked about firearms very often at all. But even though I kind of expect low rates of screening, I do have a few hypotheses for more screening among certain types of clients in certain settings. So for instance, based off some work in the veteran health administrative data, we've seen that men have significantly more firearm access documentation than women do. And we know that men are more likely to be a firearm owner. And so I do imagine that providers might say that they screen men more often than women. And I think that this could be kind of based on this idea that they might be screening people who they expect to be firearm owners or who they more likely might be a firearm owner. I also think that providers in urban locations might screen more often than providers in rural locations. A couple of studies have found that both pediatricians and social workers who live in urban areas have more engagement and an openness to firearm safety counseling. And so that's kind of based off of those findings. And then, although rates of asking about firearms are still kind of low, there is some evidence that people screen more often if there's evidence of a higher risk situation. So I do imagine that providers would ask about firearms and access to lethal means more so with clients who are suicidal or having psychotic experiences and in those kind of high risk situations. Then when it comes to provider characteristics, I mentioned that I'm really interested also in how that own person's background and characteristics might impact the way that they're thinking about these things or practicing these things. And so I do think that, it makes sense to think that providers who have education and instruction on firearm safety issues, whether it be like formal education or they're more familiar with the research and things like that, they're probably going to be screening at higher frequencies and reporting more confidence in discussing firearms with clients. And then if the provider themselves is a firearm owner or has other personal experiences with firearms, I imagine they might say that they have more confidence in being able to discuss firearms with clients if that were to come up. But I don't know that will necessarily make a big difference in whether or not they're asking about firearms regularly. And then I'm also having some exploration of how providers' demographics and personality traits might also impact or interact with these main outcomes of access screening and the confidence to discuss firearms. So I'll be interested to look at that as well. And then as far as barriers to screening go, this is based on just a couple of studies, but I think that the top barriers will be things like clients don't need it, and maybe I don't have enough time, and I don't have the expertise or the knowledge to be able to do this. And then the least endorsed barrier I'm expecting to be that safety counseling will not be effective. So this idea that it wouldn't work or it wouldn't be useful, based off of these few studies and some of the other things that I've looked at, it seems like a lot of providers don't necessarily think that it's unimportant, but they just maybe don't necessarily know how to engage in those conversations or think that they need to be the ones asking about it. So I started recruitment not too long ago and have about 100 valid responses so far, but it happened pretty quickly, so I have not been able to run those yet. So I'll be excited to see what this looks like for next GVRC day. But I expect to finish up my data collection this summer. And as far as next steps with these data go, once I get kind of a good understanding of what providers are thinking and doing when it comes to screening and thinking about firearms and mental health, I'm hoping to make a small training video that's kind of focused on firearm safety and counseling. And so I kind of picture this as a general brief psychoeducation on firearms and mental health that would address any misconceptions, concerns, or barriers that we get an understanding of from these data. And the general kind of approach to this would be to focus on the importance of screening all clients and being more proactive about figuring out who does have access to firearms and talking about those before being in a high risk situation and waiting until someone is experiencing suicidal thoughts or other crises. But I also think it'll be important to provide specific resources for providers to be able to have kind of tools to use in these conversations, because I think that, depending on what we find out from this study, it'll be important to kind of see to provide providers with kind of next steps they can do once they do find out that someone has access to a firearm. And I think ultimately the idea for me is that this can be kind of based on our most kind of basic principles of what we think important. We could provide some information on what providers are saying in this study, and if in that video provide enough resources to where if providers wanted more information, they can dig deeper, and just generally kind of pushing this idea that everyone should be kind of aware of the risks that come with firearm access, and that we can kind of tackle these firearm safety issues and efforts to increase secure firearm storage and other firearm safety from a lot of different lenses and a lot of different backgrounds and settings. So with that, I'll stop there and stop sharing my screen so I can see you guys again. Okay, I'm here. If anyone has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to answer them. I'm also going to put my email in this chat if anyone wants to reach out to me. Thank you, Jana. Hope you're doing well. Yeah, I'll wait a couple minutes. Thank you, Shelby. Oh, well, definitely feel free to pop over to any other breakout rooms and reach out to me if you have any questions or anything like that. I really appreciate all of your time and your attention. Okay. Oh, here we go. Let's see. Do I have any thoughts on when you think screening will be happening most, intake or in crisis? Yeah, that's a good question. I think that if people are screening, which I do think is like probably not very, I don't think there's going to be high rates of screening in general, but for people that are screening, I would imagine that it's going to happen most often when there is a crisis situation. So when people are, doing like suicide risk assessments and needing to identify what level of risk someone is at. So mostly in the context of like, do people have access to lethal means? I think just from my own experience and some of the research that's out there, most of the training seems to be really focused on that. So if anyone is getting any information about lethal means and firearms specifically, it's usually in that context for these providers. Thanks for your question. I hope that answered it. All right. So with that, I don't see anything else popping into this. My email is in the chat. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to go ahead and hop off. It looks like you'll have another minute or so to pop over to any other sessions that you want to check out for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.